Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Jules Corriere. I am the Outreach Programming Director here at the McKinney Center, and with me is Dr. Carter. Dr. Carter, could you introduce yourself as well?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Daryl Carter. I'm Director of Black American Studies, Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion, and a Professor of History at East Tennessee State University.
So this morning, we are really excited to have our panelists here, as well as you all who have joined this incredibly wonderful conversation that we're going to have. And to start, we're going to introduce our panelists and also kind of go over what our ground rules are going to be. We're going to keep the floor open for our panelists, but we really want you all and encourage you all who are participants to introduce yourselves in the chat bar. Maybe say where you are from, add your email address if you would like to connect with other people with these similar and shared interests, and so that we can also connect you for our next series of Usable Past that's coming up in a few more months. Well, we are really excited to have our three panelists with us here today, and Dr. Carter and I are going to introduce them. First up is Beth Kelly. And Beth, who hails from one of my old backyards when I was growing up as a teenager in Williamsburg. Beth serves as the Vice President of Education, Research, and Historical Interpretation at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. She has worked with the foundation since 1989 in a variety of interpretive and management positions. She's connecting guests with the past so that they can better understand their present and forge the future with a broader understanding. It's been consistent, a passion of Beth's. Through collaboration with her talented team, the local community, and the broader museum partners, Beth works to ensure that audiences understand the relevancy of the past and how our shared humanity connects us. Adapting the way the past is presented so that modern audiences can relate has resulted in new research on a broader understanding of the founding generation, the lives of enslaved and free Blacks, American Indians, and gender and sexual diversity. This new research, coupled with a century of understanding the Williamsburg community, has resulted in groundbreaking museum theater pieces that are performed with non-traditional cast. Also hands-on workshops allowing guests to learn from master tradespeople, immersive and engaging family programs that result in a broader understanding of the founding of our nation, and new digital programming that is reaching more teachers and educators than standalone programming ever could. Always focused on sharing her experiences, Beth has been invited to speak at several museums to instruct museum professionals on how to deliver their story to audiences. She most recently guest lectured with graduate students enrolled in advanced history studies at Johns Hopkins University, and she resides in Williamsburg in one of the historic houses with her two rescue beagles.
And it is my pleasure to introduce Kimberly Floyd, who is currently serving as the site manager at the Vance Birthplace State Historic Site. She manages the preservation and interpretation of 7 historic buildings, as well as the visitor center and museum. Kimberly has worked in the field of public history for 14 years, beginning as the education manager at the Mordecai Historic Park in Raleigh, North Carolina in 2006. She completed her master's in public history from North Carolina State University in 2008 and has continued to work in museums and historic sites. From 2009 to 2012, Kimberly was the assistant manager at the Historic Stagville, a constituent of the North Carolina State Historic Site System. And from 2012 to 2016, served as the assistant director of the City of Raleigh Museum and Pope House Museum. She has managed the research and design of numerous permanent and temporary exhibitions and maintain artifact collections across local and state agencies. Thank you for being with us today, Kimberly.
And rounding out our panel, it's my pleasure to introduce Gary Sandling. He's the Vice President of Strategy and Chief Content Officer at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia. Gary is a 17-year veteran of Monticello and currently is the Vice President of Strategy and Chief Content Officer as of January 2021. In this role, Gary will lead TJF's strategic planning efforts around the 250th anniversary of American independence. He also oversees the foundation's efforts to align its programming and communications channels to share the honest, inclusive history of Monticello and of Thomas Jefferson. From 2009 through 2020, Gary served as Vice President of Visitors Programs and Services. In this role, he leveraged the foundation's scholarly work for Monticello's more than 400,000 visitors annually through tours, workshops, and activities on site and digital resources off site. He worked for 6 years at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, training interpretive staff, planning programs, and as a site supervisor. Gary has produced new tours and programs and collaborated with colleagues in the exhibitions on Mulberry Row and the Monticello House, including the Life of Sally Hemings exhibition. He also served as president from 2016 to 2018 and past president 2018 to 2020 of the Virginia Association of Museums. He's a 1991 graduate of Vanderbilt University, majoring in history, high honors, and classical studies. He holds an MA and an MPhil degrees in history from Yale University. So welcome so much, Gary, Beth, and Kimberly. Now, as we proceed, we would love to hear your comments from participants in the chat bar. Put your questions in there as we'll be going to them later. We're going to spend the first hour or so with our panelists who will be answering some questions. I want to remind everybody that we are all humans and humans all have feelings and emotions. So keep that in mind with your questions, keeping them respectful and as I'm sure everybody will as we move forward with this exciting opportunity to hear from these three institutions how they are handling these important issues, how they can help us handle them at our own institutions moving forward. And Dr. Carter, would you like to ask the first question of our panelists?
Yes, thank you, Jules. And this is for everyone, obviously. How are your organizations handling the national conversation over race?
Do you want us to we'll just jump in. Does that sound good, Dr. Carter? Okay.
Yes, it does.
So for Colonial Williamsburg, we have been talking about race and have been trying to raise the stories of lesser known people within the community or people that have maybe not been as remembered by history for decades. We're not really well known for it, which is unfortunate, but we have been telling the African-American story since 1979. It was an integral part of our interpretation beginning in 1979. The last few years, last 4 or 5 years, there's been a decided shift within our nation, which is, I think, pushing us to have these really, really important conversations. And cultural institutions that Kimberly, Gary, and I work at, as well as many others, these are really important places for us to have these conversations in a very safe way. It's really heartwarming to me when I can see some of our costumed interpreters, after meeting guests within 15 or 20 minutes, they are talking about things that you wouldn't normally talk about with an American that you had just met, but they're talking about race, or they're talking about political divides, or they're getting into really meaty issues. The reason for that is because of Colonial Williamsburg's decades of being able to establish that we try to do everything grounded in research and history. It's not brought forward to our interpreters unless it's grounded in fact. It's actually researched, and we have a whole research department as well as many partners that help us make sure that we are grounding all of our information in fact. So these national conversations do come to us, and we have them, and we have shifted our interpretations to be conversations. And that's a shift within my 30 years. So I started as an interpreter, and Gary and I worked together for a number of years when he was here. And they were very much narratives, or they were object-based or narrative-based. So you moved people through a timeline of this happened to this date, this happened here. Now our interpretations are more about people that are then centered around a timeline or a date, but they end in dialogue. And so we always have this dialogue with our guests and allow them to unpack what they've experienced. I think a lot of you are aware that we have museum theater. So we have character interpreters, as well as regular interpreters, meaning third-person interpreters, as well as trades interpreters. But these character interpreters, they stop being in character. So they've presented somebody from the past. They stop doing that, meaning that they end their presentation and then they come out of character and they have a dialogue. And that's the most important thing for us, is to create this space that's grounded in research, that is safe for our guests to have a dialogue with our staff. Does it always go well? No, but I'm sure we'll get into that. But that's how we are entering into this conversation, both on site as well as online. We're trying to create safe spaces grounded in research, and in order for us to interact with the audience and have these very, very important conversations that we need to have as Americans. So that's where we are with the national conversation.
Gary, do you want to go next, or you want me to?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So the Vance Birthplace is a much smaller site compared to where Beth and Gary are. So the site has been around and dedicated in the early 60s. And so I will say, have also, similar to what Beth was saying, as far as telling the narrative of, and talking about the marginalized, and have been doing that for quite some time, are not known for that. Our site was founded as a shrine to our Civil War governor of North Carolina. And that's what it's been known for many, many years. So I would say, the research was really done in the early 2000s around the 27 enslaved people on the plantation. And so when I came to the site in 2016, was when I started to kind of flip the narrative on its head a bit. The site had the information, but didn't have, I would say, the support network and a bit of pushback from the community on changing any kind of narratives or programs or anything at all. So that's been what I've been working on over the past 6 years, just trying to, again, kind of bringing back to what Beth said, trying to create an environment in a space where people can come and hear these narratives of the marginalized. I mean, you have 27 enslaved people associated with the Vances on the property. You had 18 enslaved people and 11 Vances. So over half of the people there, that narrative wasn't being told regularly when I got to the site. So where we are at as far as the conversation around critical race theory and interpreting, broadening that and creating an inclusive narrative is probably at a different, I would say, a different phase than where some of your larger sites might be. And so we also are trying to create a space where people can come and have conversation. Our tours are, one of the ways that we're doing this is offering tours and information in lots of different ways, in ways that haven't been done before, through our exhibits, through audio tours, through self-guided tours. We, have had some new exhibits that we are working on and programming that we've changed. And I'm sure we'll get into that kind of that pushback that has come from the community. Even from the first program I changed was in 2017. It was our holiday program. I got rid of our candlelight tour. And people get really attached to the Christmas programs. And the first night we were supposed to do the program, the site was vandalized. So that kind of gives you an idea of the community we were working within. to change these narratives and bring them to the public. So really what we've been doing is, just creating, really rewriting tours, programs, and then preparing our staff. So it's been a lot of internal, making sure that we're all ready and able to talk to our visitors that are coming in who are upset that who feel like we're changing it, even though it's been that way for a little while now. So it's a really similar kind of place as far as conversation goes. So I'll stop there and turn it over, let Gary talk.
Thank you so much, Kim. And just to say it, the reason we wanted the three of you together is so that our participants could see how different organizations are handling this. So we've got the larger organization, we've got a more mid-sized organization, and we've got a smaller organization. So the insights that you are each sharing from the size of your organization is going to be so helpful to the different participants who are watching this today, and to see what, the similarities and the differences between these organizations and what their struggles are. So thank you for being so frank about it, and for letting us know what's happening in the smaller places as well, and the specific challenges that happen when you're coming from a smaller organization. And Gary, to add to this, how is your organization working through this national conversation right now?
It's a really good question. And I would say, like Beth said, there's been, I'd say for about 30 years, in fact, for almost exactly 30 years, there's been a much more concerted effort to share the history of enslaved people and the families who lived at Monticello, and to sort of populate the landscape with narratives that weren't just centered on Jefferson, and to stop using the euphemisms about servants that were commonly used, sort of reground Monticello as a plantation, not just a house or, a kind of construct. So that's gone on for a while. I'd say what's different now, and has been, as Beth indicated, I'd say a turning point for us in some ways was I'll back up for a second. There had been plans for years to restore more of what we call the landscape of slavery at Monticello, and put back some of that plantation context. So the area near the house that's called Mulberry Row, and actually I'm going to do the thing. Oh, I can't share a screen. Okay, that's all right.
I'll let you do it. Hang on just a second.
Okay. I promise I won't do it too much. So when you think about a plantation, a context like Monticello, this kind of aerial shot, which was taken several years ago, it sort of emphasizes its beauty. It emphasizes the kind of aesthetic considerations Jefferson had when he had his house built. But the plantation landscape is largely erased. And so there has been some work in the last several years to reestablish that landscape. So for about the last 10 years, there's been attempts to put back, and I'm going to skip through some things here, some of the enslaved quarters, to restore period buildings, so give more definition, restore kind of the connections between these places. So the first thing I'd say that's different was this effort to reground the landscape and reconnect the landscape in ways that made slavery much more obvious, and gives someone, even visually, an awareness that they might not have otherwise. And so that labor included a variety of efforts, but included new exhibitions as well as restoring and reconstructing buildings. So that may sound really basic, and it kind of is, but sort of that dedication of putting a built environment back that reinforces the landscape of slavery. And then in the midst of that came, the shooting of Michael Brown in St. Louis, and the protests that came from that, as well as then Trayvon Martin, as well as a whole host of much more highly profiled police shootings and the protests that came from it. And really in the midst of that, I'd say for us was a lesson about we talk about this history, but how are we connecting that history to larger issues of race and of racism? We weren't really doing that. And, you know, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, well, you know, our job is to fully contextualize the history. Our job is to talk about what we know about this place, and we know about these people, what we know about Jefferson as an enslaver, as well as the author of the Declaration, all those questions, as well as probably the most media covered component of that for Monticello is to talk about Sally Hemings. So all of that, you know, I would have said 10 years ago, absolutely, we do that. We need to do more of it. But we weren't connecting the dots necessarily. We weren't saying notions of race are rooted in this institution. The stories of people here give you tangible, immediate, emotionally connected stories of the legacies of race. That is what's changed. And I think to get a good sense of that, in some ways, if you may have heard of or seen Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America, Smith has a chapter about Monticello in his book. And I really recommend that book for a variety of reasons for anyone thinking about these issues in terms of memory and history. And, you know, the complexities of that and the pushback of that and the kind of ways in which visitors engage or don't want to engage with that. He has a good coverage of that in the book. So I'd say two things happened: a more deliberate act of recreating the landscape, but then also changing our training. So we have about, you know, certainly we are mid-sized. So we, you know, compared to the kind of size of staff at Colonial Williamsburg, much smaller staff, but we have about 70 interpreters. So people who give tours, programs, things like that on a part-time or full-time basis. We began to, in 2018, when we restored spaces that included one that tells the story of the life of Sally Hemings, we actually trained all of our staff, not just the interpretive staff, but if you worked in IT or accounting or anywhere else, you got a less in-depth but equal, but a training that was focused on why and how we talk about race as a social construct. It's not a biological construct, and that for a lot of our staff was something they had to struggle with, and that kind of training is ongoing. So these are ways in which we try to create an atmosphere and a staff engaged with these questions. And then, you know, I would be remiss if I didn't say something that, at least to us in Charlottesville, is very obvious. August 12th, 2017 really changed locally the intensity and urgency of that effort. And I can't, you know, I don't think I can convey strongly enough. You know, I try to imagine, I'm from Tennessee, from the western part of the state. I go home to visit my family from Obion County. You know, for them, their reaction to what happened was not, you know, it was sort of like, oh, that's unfortunate. It was deeply traumatic in this city. And, you know, a woman was killed and people were permanently injured and beaten by a group of white supremacists who, if you looked at their websites ahead of their coming to Charlottesville, it was perfectly clear they were coming to fight over statues. And that moment also, I think, gave a greater sense of urgency about how we talk about these issues. So those are things that are different. There's still more work to be done, but this is how I'd say over the last 5-6 years in particular, the focus has changed. We're much more explicit about saying the stories of people here are stories that directly you can see reflected in them, in the suffering, in the oppression, in the resilience, in the you know, in all of these ways, the legacy of slavery, and that legacy is directly involved with race and with the notion of racial supremacy. So those are concepts we've introduced, you know, over those last several years.
Thank you. Jules, you want to ask the next question?
Sure, and just thank you, Gary. I really want to remark on the notion of changing your training to include everybody, not just the interpreters. I think that's a really important point, and I'm wondering if Colonial Williamsburg, and before we move on to the next question, just to connect with that a little bit more, is Colonial Williamsburg and Vance Birthplace also incorporating or thinking about incorporating this institution-wide training for this? I'd love to hear from you all.
Kimberly, you want to go first? Yeah.
Sure. So I will say there's only 3 staff at the Vance Birthplace. So we have me, the site manager, our assistant site manager, who also, you know, is our collections manager and education manager and all the other jobs, and then a maintenance employee who also does school programs. So there's just 3 of us. So it's been one of the things, you know, when you brought up 2017, we were in the midst of planning a symposium that was going to examine the legacy or lack thereof of Zebulon Vance, and it changed everything. That was the same year that we were vandalized. It changed how we thought about what we were doing. There were a lot of threats at the site to burn it down, to come out to the site, and when you only have 3 staff, my goal was to keep the staff safe first and then move next. And so that means physically and emotionally and mentally. So our training has been I'm very lucky to have good staff. We've read numerous books to try and help with, working through the history of race, looking at like Stamped from the Beginning, things like that, and staff reading through it and discussing it. We have regular conversations about what's happening. We are on the front lines. So like we are constantly being, dealing with angry and upset visitors. I will say that. So our training has been very much how to respond when visitors are coming at us angry about erasing history, critical race theory, any of these things. And honestly, one of the most things that has been helpful is that we actually created a notebook where we started writing down incidents in the notebook, and then we can come back to them and discuss them after the fact. Because if we're having a program, the 3 of us aren't necessarily together. It's all hands on deck, but we're spread all over. So training is more of what has happened today, what did someone say today, and how did we respond, and how can we do that better in the future? And then, what are some standard things that we're constantly getting asked, and how can we respond to those? In addition to that, I will say in the last 2 years, since we are a North Carolina State Historic Site, we are under the Division of State Historic Sites, which is housed in the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources for the state. And so they have created resources and trainings online that we do regularly. I mean, I get them all the time, every other week. I have some online training related to bias within even just our own work environment, not with the public, but we have that. We have a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee within the division and the department that is continually helping us and sending us trainings. So we have a supportive environment in that regard if we need something. But I would say, as far as training for staff on the day-to-day, it's the 3 of us. So it's a lot of just conversation happening between, I just basically roll my chair over and they're right next to me. So, that's kind of where I'm at.
Yes, and as far as Colonial Williamsburg goes, very similar to what Kimberly just said, and Gary as well. And I'll be completely transparent. In April of 2020, pandemic hits, death of George Floyd, and that's a really pivotal awakening for us. And we wanted to make sure that we were giving our staff the information that they needed and the support that they needed. So one of my colleagues, Kentrice, and he's in charge of our training and professional development. We called the experts, the person that we knew could help us, and that was Gary. So we called Gary and we talked through what they were doing at Monticello, and that really helped us reshape and retool our training for our interpreters. And we have a little over 500 interpreters who are age from 10, because we have junior interpreters. I think the oldest staff member that I have is 83. So we have kind of a range of learning that we are dealing with our interpreters, but it was embedded into, meaning that this was a slave society. And as Americans, we have to accept that we are the product of a slave society. It's embedded and rooted in all of our training. And that is the content that we deliver. But like Kimberly, we have spent a lot of time helping our interpreters through the traumatic aspects of interpreting slavery. We are in costume. I think all of you probably know that, but that can bring on a whole different array of reactions from guests for a white female, for a black female, for a black male, for a white male. Different impressions or different reactions come from our guests. So we have set up a lot of supportive elements for our staff, which range from a peer support team. So if you have issues, you can go to one of our peer support team members who is your peer, but they have been trained on how to work with you and talk through you with a traumatic event, or maybe you even need further help than that. We also have parameters. The guest is not always right. And so we have very clear parameters for our guests that are on our bus loop, and they're in all of our advertisement online. This is how we expect you will interact with our guests. And if you don't, we will escort you off the property. And that has happened where we have had that. So we have these kind of elements where we're trying to protect and be supportive of the team while they are conducting these conversations. These are weighty conversations, and they are much, much more impactful for our African-American staff than they are for our Caucasian staff. So that African-American staff as well, we set aside a time every month. They have an hour and a half. It's just them. Nobody else is there. It's just them. They talk amongst themselves. This is what I went through. I'm not sure exactly what happens, but they are given that scheduled time, that paid time to talk with each other. And if anything is needed out of that, they will come to me and say, Beth, these are issues that we think we need you to help address, and or they're just there together in fellowship and in support of one another, because they do something that I can't do and that many of my white colleagues, we can't do either. So they're doing something above and beyond what any of the rest of us are doing in facilitating these conversations. So our training has changed and has adapted greatly. We rely on our colleagues when we see how well they're doing something. We just ask, and they are always super supportive. Gary has been very, very supportive, and I will probably call Kimberly after this as well, just to see where she is. We are very big on mental health at Colonial Williamsburg too, which is awkward for some of our team, but we're going to talk about it and we're going to keep moving through it, because it is a really difficult time outside of talking about race. It's just a really difficult time. So we want to make sure everybody has those resources as they're interfacing with everybody. But that's where we are with training.
Thank you. And I just want to add to that, and Kimberly was talking about the people who are upset about, reinterpretation, things of that nature at the band side. We really are, and I come from a background as a political historian. I'll tell you, we've been in a war for about 60 years now, and the country is just now realizing it. And this war is over. The front lines are in the areas of academic history, public history, historic preservation, about the meaning of truth and fact. And so this is a very, very dangerous time, and it's incumbent upon all of us to really, back up our colleagues here who are on the front lines of this, who are dealing with it every day. And those threats are very real. And whether you're talking about Gary talking about the issue over Charlottesville, or we're talking about threats at Vance, or threats at the HBCUs, or threats in the Capitol or somewhere else, these are real. They're not going away. We have to not only be aware of it, but we have to acknowledge it, that it is happening in order to start addressing the problem. It's not as if this is the entire country. It is a minority of the country, but it is a sizable minority of the country that has the wherewithal to cause havoc and bloodshed and misery for the rest of the country. And so we have to deal with this. And this is going to continue until such time as the country either puts a stop to it or enough people, enough blood has been shed to where people say enough, we're not doing this. But you know, this gets into other issues around the meaning of democracy and what we are and who we are. And the you know, as my colleagues in history around the country, particularly those like Timothy Snyder have talked about, the unraveling of democracy does not happen necessarily with the bayonet. It happens in law. It happens in these smaller scales and venues in which things are done. And so suddenly you wake up one day and it's no longer there. And so that third rail of race is really tearing us apart right now. The question becomes, at what point do we either turn back or do we go over the cliff? So I throw that out there for everybody as we're talking about this, because this is not simply an academic issue. This is a very real world issue for the people that are on the front line of it, as well as for the rest of us. Thank you.
One of the things that I've found really interesting with our public when they come in is that I find that they use critical race theory. They'll drop that term on us, and it feels like they're equating critical race theory to just historical analysis and interpretation and what we do on a daily basis. And so they'll use that term, and I'm like, that actually what we're doing is just connecting history to today and having conversation. And just as Beth was saying, that conversation that we're having now, people call it critical race theory when it's just actual historic analysis and conversation. And it's literally the job of a public historian. And so, you know, they'll equate it to cancel culture or erasing history. And that happens on a daily basis. And so one of the questions that came through was about a board. And I was saying, you know, I think the reason we've been able to do what we've done with such a small staff at the Advanced Birthplace is I had to go out and find community members that actually supported what we wanted to do, because the amount of pushback and people who didn't, in the community, who didn't want me to start. I mean, I had school groups that told me they didn't want me to take the school kids into the slave dwelling. And so I changed it and started it there, but the amount of people who didn't support it. So I had to go find those people, and we actually created a new board for the site, the Mountain History and Culture Group, which is a support group for the site that could help me further those, you know, what we're doing, because the support just wasn't there before that.
Thanks, Kim. This leads into our next question, which is, what are some specific programs that you have instituted recently that may be accepted or may be rejected by the community, but you know are important and needed right now? And I think hearing about some of these specific programs might give some ideas and inspiration to the other participants who are here listening. And we'll also talk about the challenges in those, but let's hear some real specific programs, and anyone can start.
And by programs, you're talking about interpretive programs? Is that what you're going for? Or, well, I have a couple of examples.
Yes,
I'll
yes.
just throw out a couple. So one of the, and this kind of goes back to a little bit of what Dr. Carter was mentioning just a few minutes ago as well, is the choice of what stories we bring forward. Now, I have the advantage over Gary, or maybe it's a disadvantage, it could go either way, over Gary and Kimberly, in that we have a whole town. So it's not one site with maybe 30 or 40 people's story to tell. You know, I have a town of 500 people's stories. So which stories do we pull forward? What are the stories that are going to help us better understand the founding generation and help us better understand who we are as Americans today. So it can be kind of daunting when you look at those. But we are really making sure that we're also pulling stories forward. And we use the term enslaved, we use the term enslaver. These are terms we use, but we use a lot more terms of self-liberation, of people who are thinking in this community of how do I liberate myself from this bondage? How do I liberate myself from these systems of oppression? Which may be, I'm going to leave this community that I am in, where I am an enslaved person to this master, and I am going to run someplace else or go someplace else. I'm self-liberating myself. For years, we used to call them runaways. They were self-liberating. So we're changing some of our vocabulary on that. Some of the newer programs that we have had, I will tell you, one is called Created Equal. It's a museum theater program. So it is using modern theater techniques to get to the past, to tell the stories of the past. And it is about a 35-minute program. We actually have it online if you want to see it. We designed it for July 4th, 2019, and it had even more impact for us in the subsequent years that we've been performing it. Created Equal is the story of the African-American experience through history. It's from 1619 really through to present day. It is devised by 4 of our actors who are African-American. They created it themselves, and it is their story. It is the African-American experience in America and what does the July 4th, what does independence mean to me? Very relevant to that, and that we performed on July 4th. The reaction to that was, I would say, pretty typical to any of our programming. You have those that are very much immediately on board, very supportive, want to see it. Those that are in the middle who are like, ooh, should we like this or shouldn't we? And they choose to like it. And then you have those that are just, no matter what we do, they're going to feel as though we're attacking them or that they are being made to feel guilty. And it's not the line we walk. We truly try to walk the line right in the middle of, so that nobody feels any shame about the past or feels any guilt about the past, because not a single person on this call can change the past. But we sometimes have that reaction. So that's one program, Created Equal, which, as I said, looking at the African-American experience through the eyes of African Americans and written by African Americans. Another new program or new set of interpretations that we're doing right now is our trades interpretations. You're probably all very familiar. We have about 30 tradespeople that operate and continue the trades from the 18th century using practices that were done there. There's an apprenticeship program. They start as an apprentice, move to a journeyman, move to the master of the trade. Peek behind the curtain, we had never done research on who was actually doing the trade. So within the last 2 years, we have begun exhaustive research on the African Americans. This town, the house that I'm sitting in, the town that I work in and day out, is nothing but a monument to African Americans, to enslaved people. They're the ones who made the bricks. They're the ones who built the houses. They're the ones who sawed the wood. They're the ones who put the buildings together that survive. So we have begun this exhaustive research, and the tradespeople are going through training on making sure that they are not only just talking about the mechanics of the trade, but who did the trade and who was coming and doing the interacting with the tradespeople. There's some remarkable stories of craftsmanship and tradesmen here in Williamsburg that we have not pulled forward and are now pulling forward. So the last set of new things that we are doing are very much around that story of self-liberation. It is the First Baptist Church, where we are working with the local community, and we have not been good about working with the local community within the last 5 or 6 years. Again, learning from examples from a lot of our peers, we are working closer with the local community, and it is making a huge difference. Any cultural institution that thinks they can stand alone in a community can't. And so we have really been trying to acknowledge where we have not done well by the African community in particular, and we're doing that as well with the indigenous communities, but specifically with the African American community. We're working with them to reconstruct the First Baptist Church, which is the first church by African Americans, enslaved people mostly, who came together to worship together and began their church together and were recognized first by the Dover Associates. So it is a project that is very, very important to us. Has all of that gotten us people that don't agree with that? Yes. Have we lost support? Yes. Our board of trustees, as well as our senior leadership team, are very much committed to doing this work, to telling a complete story, to whatever it takes. Have we gained new support? Yes, we have. So those are a couple of the ways that we have some new programs. We have also begun research on LGBTQIA plus, which has garnered probably the most outrage presently, but that's probably another conversation. But that's where we are, and those are some new programs that we have got going on.
I think so. For us, one of the things we have experimented with over several years, since about 2012, actually, I took a group of interpreters down to the Levine Museum of the New South when Janine Bryant was their VP of Education, and they were doing really cutting edge facilitated dialogue programming around their exhibition about desegregation. And that is so we then offered kind of a series of these dialogic programs, which didn't get a lot of uptake. But they were good grounding and training for us to then, we now offer on a regular basis. We just relaunched it. The pandemic, of course, for many places sort of really did a number on what we could offer and how we could offer it. But we finally, again, began a program that we started, 2014, 15, a tour experience of Monticello that focuses on the Hemmings family. So something called the Hemmings Family Tour. So it's not just about, there are actually 70 enslaved people or so at Monticello over 3 generations who are part of this family. So we highlight the stories of 6 of them. And so in other words, the way anyone on the tour experiences Monticello is through that lens. That program contains a dialogic element as well. So in other words, conversation in the midst of the program. It's not brand new, but it is something that certainly before the pandemic, we were offering it daily. And that particular program had the greatest diversity of racial diversity of any particular program we offered at Monticello. So there were people, African-Americans, for whom this program had appeal, whereas clearly what they thought they might expect from a different tour experience did not. So that's an example, but I would say for us, probably the most important example now, and as we prepare for the 250th, is using the sort of taking the fruits of what's been a 30-year research project. So in 1993, a now retired historian at Monticello, Cinder Stanton, undertook oral history projects of the families of enslaved people at Monticello. It's called the Getting Word Oral History Project. She, in concert with the late Dr. Diane Swan Wright, who was a skilled oral history interviewer, and Beverly Gray, a genealogist from Ohio, they basically began tracing from the dispersal sales of the families enslaved at Monticello after Jefferson's death, tracking these families and finding relatives and sometimes connecting people who didn't know they were even related. So currently there are over 225 of these interviews. And excuse me, my colleague here at Monticello, Andrew Davenport, is the current manager of that project. You know, Andrew refers to this archive as an archive of freedom. So the travails of freedom, life for these families after their own liberation, life for these families after the Civil War. So we're looking at ways to tell those family stories in an arc, you know, beyond the history of Jefferson, and ground them in what is essentially, you know, kind of the American story. How do generations after the founding era take up the idea of freedom or the idea of equality and demand their place with it, right? Because this is something you can see over and over, and connect that to the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. So Clearly, Jefferson and his contemporaries excluded whole categories of people from who they thought should be part of the political nation in the Declaration. I mean, this is obvious. But other people weren't content with that, and they took that framework, to define, demand their place. So, excuse me. So using those stories to tell that broader story is something that in our exhibitions we've begun to do, and we will continue to do up to 2026.
Thank you. Okay, I want to go ahead and ask the group to comment on this next question. What is your hardest piece of interpretation? And just for funsies, what is your favorite?
And Kimberly, you have to go first. We overtalked you on the last one, so we're going to.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions about our programming and changes that we've made. Honestly, one of the hardest parts of I would say, around the interpretation, and this was more of a personal change for me, was I struggled for a while there when we were trying to change our tours and tell the narrative of the enslaved people associated with the site. I kept thinking, how do I do this? I don't have the resources, I don't have the artifacts, we don't have a lot of documentation around the enslaved people. How do I do this? And so it was, and I was coming to the site from other jobs that had well-documented histories around the enslaved people. So when I got to Vance, it was just much more vague information. And I was like, I'm just really struggling. And I was actually in a training, and someone had said to me, well, how many of the artifacts in the Vance house are original to the Vances? And I was like, oh, like 2. The rest of it's items just from the time period that are in there. And he was like, yeah, you make a story for the Vances every day. So he was like, how do you, and that's what I found the hardest, honestly, was flipping my mind from and trying to look at artifacts in a different way and resources in a different way, looking at the wills that we had and how I could tell the story and interpret the story of the enslaved people with these same resources that I was using to tell the story of the Vances. So, honestly, it was surprisingly difficult, even though I had been working at former plantations for almost 10 years before I even got to the Vance birthplace. It was just that the resources that I had available to me were different than I had experienced in the past. One of the things I've enjoyed the most, honestly, recently is we've been digging a lot into a lot of the stories around the women at the property. And so we've been doing a lot with what happened after Zebulon Vance. There was a woman, Elizabeth Hemphill, who lived on the property alone, running that farm for years, eventually ran a post office out of there. And so that's been kind of fun. So, over.
Kim, thanks for that. I also would like to know, I'm hearing a lot about stories. Stories are being used at all of your sites. Where did you go, Kim, to find the stories of these women? What are your resources? Because where you find them might help our participants also know where to go looking.
Right. So that actually brings me back. I can just use, one example when we were talking about programming. I know I mentioned our holiday program. So I got rid of our candlelight tour and created a new program called an Appalachian Christmas Carol. And I was working with a theater company here called the American Myth Center. And so it's a tour that people go throughout the site, and they are, it's based on Dickens' Christmas Carol. And so they are met by the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, and they're learning the story of Venus, who was an enslaved woman on the property. And we, the resources that we have for that are she went on the auction block in the 1840s and was bought back by Myra Baird Vance for $1 at that time. So we have the estate sale. So we know that that happened. We have an anecdote, a story that Zebulon Vance's brother tells. And so some of that, we've used that story and we just say, you know, it has to be taken with a grain of salt. The fact, we do know for fact that she was ascended the auction block and was, you know, bought back by Myra for $1 because we have the estate sale. We use census records. And then honestly, the research just continues always. I think that's interesting too, is people think that, you know, oh, the research is done, and we still find stuff today. I have board members who are working on other projects and will find a connection to the enslaved people at Vance and send us papers and resources. So for us, it's been a lot of estate sales, wills, census records. We also utilize, in the same way I utilized, for example, to furnish the Vance house. We didn't know what all the Vances had in the house, but I know what generally was in a house in the 1830s by looking at furnishing plans for other properties around the area with families of similar stature. So I can do the same thing for the enslaved people by looking at slave narratives and stories from other properties, other families that would have been equivalent to, you know, wealth-wise to the Vances. And I can have a better understanding of what the lives would have been like for the enslaved people on the Vance property. So just because I don't have a story for specific to the Vances, I might have one, a slave narrative that's from another property nearby.
Thanks, Kim.
I'll just point out real quick, for those in the audience that might be interested, the WPA papers are a resource for you if you're interested. This came out of the mid to late 30s, where the Federal Writers Project interviewed survivors. And it's in part how public historians, academic historians, and others know about a lot of what was taking place there in the mid 19th century and after the war and Reconstruction. Sorry to interrupt.
We were talking about difficult programs or a challenging one particular challenging program, or one that was one of your favorites. And Kim has answered that, and we'd love to hear from Gary and from Beth as
So yeah, quickly, I'd say as maybe not so much a program, but the question of how to talk about Sally Hemings and the question of rape, how to describe the sexual relationship, this kind of relationship of power that Jefferson exercised over her. This is it's hard for us because we have an exhibition that premiered in 2018 that tells the story of her life through an account her son left in a newspaper in the 1870s. This is one of the children she has with Jefferson. His name is Madison Hemings. And that story, that narrative, at least pared down to the parts that really focus on her life, is a really powerful device for doing that. And it's done in a very dramatic way, which was new territory for us. But it's effective, it's emotionally effective, emotionally resonant. But this question of how to describe this has been one that proves very contentious. So, you know, there are clearly people who, drawing upon, you know, intersectionalist feminist literature and law and critical race, to some degree, critical race theory from the 1990s on. The only way to describe this in any modern context is rape. It's an abuse of power. That's how you should describe it, full stop. And we also have scholars and actually descendants who have different points of view about this. So we talk about it in a way that says this is thought of by many people as rape. And we also talk about the ways in which some scholars and descendants think about her life and how using a label like that can be problematic from their vantage point. And so we try to offer that broader perspective, but that can prove to be very contentious. So that I would say is the biggest challenge. And then I'd say most enjoyable for me, actually, every 4th of July, we host a naturalization ceremony. We have for 60 something years on the west lawn of Monticello. And so the local federal district court comes and swears in 40, 45 new citizens, and there's an open mic. And I would say if your historic site has an opportunity to ever do something like that, or be a polling, like ways to plug into the larger fabric of our civic life, it's my favorite day to be at work, even though it's hotter than the hinges of Hades and there's no shade. And it's beautiful because there's an opportunity for those citizens to talk about kind of their experience. It's very moving. So that's my answer.
And yes, and to both of what my colleagues said, I have similar stories with both of those comments. The one thing I'll just add a little bit more on mine, the most difficult piece for me has been gaining the trust of my team, particularly the African Americans on my team, to carry these stories and carry these stories forward and to gain their perspective. Something that Kimberly said, it's switching our mindset of how we look at the past and how we understand the research that has been done and asking new questions. And I'll give you a quick example of that. We used to do a program, I mentioned this before, about the runaway, looking at runaway ads. Now we talk about it as self-liberating, but that's only because our African-American colleagues, that's how they see it. That's how they want to see it. And it makes us think differently. And we're looking at that runaway ad. It's a whole hour program. And it's fascinating between our master interpreter who's at the millinery shops, or our master, she's a mistress of the millinery, but she's gained that skill and that trade. So she's the master of that shop. She's doing it with one of our African-American actors who portrays an enslaved person. And they're looking at one runaway ad, and the information both are extracting out to create the narratives about the past are very, very different. So that's just one thing that has been difficult, was gaining the trust and thinking differently about how we look at primary sources and how we look for information. There's more out there than you think there is regarding the past. It's just that nobody's bothered to look for it. And now we're asking different questions. And I saw somebody put that in the chat, what are you, research is never done, and it's not ever done. The most rewarding is probably when I get that connection or that feedback from a guest or an audience member. So we do a program at the Capitol. It's called Resolved, an American Experiment, which is it's a non-traditional, it's a theater program, but it's taking guests through the events leading from 65 up until we declare independence in 76. And there's a whole section, the middle part is all about the non-representation of this new government at the time that our nation was coming forward. And I got a letter, and I've gotten similar letters since, from somebody in Northern Virginia he's a city manager, and he said, I never thought about the disenfranchised people as much as your program made me think about it. And I need to be thinking more about that as a city manager, and I need to impress that upon my team to make sure we're always thinking about the voices that aren't as well heard as others in my community. That to me is pure joy. That to me is pure feedback. When a kid can write in who's African-American or is maybe LGBTQI and says, or Indigenous, says, I see myself in the past. That to me is the joy that I take out of the work that we do. And there was a question about Indigenous people, and we very much are very strong with that and are working very closely with our local governments, our local Native governments, to try to bring forward that story. And we're actively recruiting. We have a very small but strong American Indian initiative, but that's a voice that is not very much heard from, particularly at the time of the revolution. And my dear friend, Mr. Jefferson, mentioned he couldn't be in Williamsburg without seeing Native faces. So we have much, much more work to do on that, but we are working on that as well and moving that forward.
Thank you all. I've got one more question from Dr. Megan Toole, who each of you know, before we open the floor up to our participants for questions. And that is, what are the benefits that your institutions are experiencing since incorporating these programs? of inclusion?
I know, I'm like, who wants to start?
I'll rattle off a few things and then you guys pick it up. So one of the benefits that we are seeing is being able to bring people into the conversation. And Gary mentioned civics, and that's very important to us, that people understand what their relationship is to government and what their relationship is within this constitutional democracy. So that is a benefit for us. I didn't really talk about this very much, but we work with teachers as well. So we have a Teacher Institute program. On site, the 500 people come on site every summer. It's fairly large as far as Teacher Institute programs go, but online we're reaching about 12,000 people through some of the classes that we're doing. That just exploded over the last couple of years. But that is one of the benefits. Is it a benefit? It is a benefit to our institution. That's our goal, so that the future may learn from the past. That's what our mission statement is. So for us, that's a benefit to see this ripple effect, to see our cultural institution trying to help fill the void of civic education and fill the void of being able to talk about race and religion. And I will tell you, when we asked our teachers, hey, what do you need? The number one thing they told us they needed was help in teaching about race in the classroom. Where does it come from? Why is it here? Why is it a part of our society? What started it? And so we have developed a curriculum for our teachers to do that. The second thing I'll tell you our teachers asked us for was help students understand how to discern the truth. They are pulling their truths from social, they're pulling it from family, they're pulling it from community, and they wanted help being able to have students look at primary sources and come up with the truth or the facts around those primary sources, rather than listening to all these other truths that they are assigning as actual truth, if that makes sense. So these are benefits to our organization when we're making those connects, and that's what we're trying to amplify and impact even more going forward, because we feel very, very strongly about that.
Thank you so much. And we want to spend these next 10 or 15 minutes trying to take some questions from I'm sorry, Jules, go ahead.
Dr. Carter, we hadn't heard from Gary and Kim yet about the benefits that their institutions had experienced before we open it back
You're
up.
very good. You got me. Sorry, my apologies.
Quickly, so I think benefits. We've built relationships with partners in the community and nationally and locally through these efforts that we might not have had before. So, we're talking to, so those are a benefit. And I want to really underscore what Beth said. I think about teachers, we have similar kind of programs, smaller scale, absolutely the same kinds of requests. And I think that's going to become even more so. We are well aware that, states are passing laws about what teachers are supposed to say or not say in classrooms. Those laws are vague. They're deliberately vague. They're designed to exploit particular ideological ends. And, private foundations like ours or Colonial Williamsburg or others, I think it makes it more incumbent upon us to sort of share that full, honest history and to give them tools and ideas about how they can do this. Because as the child of two public school teachers and the spouse of another, and a former one myself, I cannot tell you how strongly I am agitated about this idea that there's this kind of attempt to intimidate people who often don't have a lot of power themselves and whose administrators don't always back them. So I think anything we can do to help is really incumbent upon us.
I would say, again, kind of we're in a different phase of where we are. A lot of people, teachers, I would agree, where that is our same goal. Where we do get school groups, but because of the site's history, I think a lot of our visitors either assume that we don't talk about slavery, or they know that we do and then don't want to come to the site. So I've had people literally say, I hate Zebulon Vance, I won't step foot on your site. Or I love Zebulon Vance, but you don't talk about him enough, so I won't step foot on your site. So I'm hoping that as we continue to do this and we can grow trust in the community and continue to grow that, so that teachers will come and use us as a resource. Because right now, generally what we get is teachers, as I said before, that don't want to come to the site because we take the children in the slave dwelling. So I'm hoping that that changes, and we just stay steadfast. And one of the benefits I will say that I have noticed in the last even year is just simply our visitation has become more diverse. It used to just solely be white people from like 45 to 65. And so it's much more diverse now, which is good.
Thank you. And now we'll go ahead and take questions. So if you'll put your questions in the chat, I'll go ahead and help facilitate that. Thank you. I'll go ahead and start. How, we're having this debate here in Tennessee over the issue of banned books. We've had school districts remove books from their school libraries, ban them from their curriculum, things of that nature. Any thoughts about that?
Oh boy, so many.
Right? I'm like, whoa. I don't even.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who is like as I said, I'm from Tennessee. In fact, my family has lived in the northwest corner of Tennessee for about 200 years. So I have followed some of that, more carefully maybe than I would have otherwise. So actually what I would say is one of the things about, even though I work at a site like the one I work at, I don't think we have to be, beholden to every morsel of quotation that some founding political elite, said to chart our future. But one of the things that I would say that Jefferson was a real advocate of was the free exchange of ideas and information. And I think that's an idea that, at least in the parameters of our assuming sort of broad-based democratic participation in government, is kind of critical. So, it's certainly, to me, that has to be done. Obviously we are much more aware now, though, of the ways in which that kind of speech can harm people. So clearly we have to have guardrails on these kinds of things, but it's not an encouraging trend, I think, in terms of how we can help share a more honest history if we're worried about, just outright banning books.
Well, I get asked that question a lot in my work, and my thought is, and my response to people now is, we're worried, for example, about Maus and the Holocaust. We're worried about To Kill a Mockingbird or other books that have language and discrimination to it. But, at the same time, or sex scenes or things of that nature. But the real question that I usually throw back at people is, how much sex is your kid watching on their iPhone? How many times are they watching you use drugs? How many times are they watching their father or brother or somebody else commit acts of domestic violence? And of course, that ticks people off. But we have one question here to go along, I think, with some of that. And so let me go ahead and jump there, and then you can contribute. Beth and Kimberly can contribute to both questions as well. And that is, why is having diverse cultural interpretation important to your science and community in terms of tourism and the economy? And they're not mutually exclusive. So if you can, all three of you can answer that, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Well, for us, there is no, so first and foremost, we have to look at our mission. So our mission is that the future may learn from the past. So we're here to educate the public. We are committed to telling a full and complete story. It's important that everybody sees themselves in the past. They haven't always been able to do that at Colonial Williamsburg. And many people think that they still can't. We talked a little bit about that at the very beginning of our conversation. with not just our site, but also Kimberly mentioned that at her site as well. And so it's important for us that everybody sees themselves in the past, that they understand that this is American history. It's not African-American history. It's not white history. It's not indigenous history. All of it is our history. So how that then affects tourism and the economy is that, as long as we're true to our mission, and curtains back on Colonial Williamsburg again, we haven't always been true to our mission. We've had this kind of confusing sometimes, what is our role? But right now our board and our senior team is committed that this is who we are. That builds a very strong following with our certainly supporters, our donors, but also with the community, which just makes it stronger, which makes the economy better, which makes tourism better. So it all goes hand in glove, but you've got to work it together in order to make that happen. But it's not as though we're telling these stories to drive tourism. So I want to be really clear about that. Or it's not as though we're not telling a story to drive tourism. That's just not happening. We have made the decision. We have a master interpretive plan. That's where we're going. This is what we've agreed upon. This is where we're headed. And everything else sort of falls into place.
For the Vance birthplace, I would say, understanding kind of where we're located too is extremely important. We're in Buncombe County, right outside of Asheville. It's a huge tourism destination here. And there is a lot of, a bit of animosity, I would say, in the Asheville area between like local community and the level of tourism and what's happening in the community. And so it's a very fine line to walk. So our goal is to, we actually talk about the history of the growing tourism industry in Asheville and how it was built on the backs of enslaved people. A lot of times people think that tourism is like a new thing in Asheville or Western North Carolina in general, but it's been around a long time. And so that's part of the mission at the site, is to help people understand. We get a ton of people off the Blue Ridge Parkway who have no idea what they're walking into. They walk in and they say, what is this place? Who is Zebulon Vance? And our goal is, before they leave, that if they are then going into downtown Asheville to walk around and participate in the tourism industry and the economy, that they at least, they understand the ground that they're walking on and how it got there. And so I would say that's why it's important. And again, it kind of comes to looking at like what's happening nationally. These conversations around critical race theory, anything that's happening nationally is impacting our day-to-day interpretation, and it really always has, even if we haven't necessarily acknowledged it.
So I think it's important to us, I think, in part because we certainly understand that there's a really vibrant tourism component for the kinds of people in the United States who aren't typical historic site visitors, right? So thinking about people of color, particularly African-American tourism. I sit on the board of the local Convention and Visitors Bureau, and one of the initiatives we're engaged in now is to promote and elevate sort of Black-owned businesses and restaurants. There's an initiative. We're part of the Virginia Tourism Corporation right now. For any of you on that side of the line, from where everyone is listening from, has an initiative to help a kind of diversity and equity workbook. To kind of help think about the ways in which tourism draw. You can create a better awareness and diversity of experiences. So I'd say for us, I certainly share, and first of all, I applaud that. To hear Beth say that, that's about Colonial Williamsburg's focus. It's not about the tourism draw. The programming is driven by mission, but I think the awareness does help draw a more diverse group. And for Monticello it's not the only significant tourism draw in Charlottesville, to be sure, but it's a major one. So for us, we think it is important. And long term, one of the things we've said to the board, I've said to our board of trustees over the years, is to say, looking at the demographics of the United States, if you rely solely on this traditional audience that you've had, no business would build a business plan. Sometimes you have to talk to these folks, like you have to use the for-profit language, right? So, no business plan with growth in mind would just be relevant to this one audience, and they certainly understand that.
Excellent. And, to go just a little bit further on this, if we went back 40 years, historic preservationists and public historians have wrestled with these issues about proper interpretation, have wrestled with issues regarding how the public would respond, especially the more isolated or small sites around the country that were more vulnerable to the whims of local bigwigs and donors and things of that nature. But it seems like we have reached a point where, even though, as Beth said, we're focusing on this master interpretive plan here, there is now, it seems like, an added benefit that a lot of people from diverse backgrounds are wanting this information, they're wanting this interpretation, and they are making up, so to speak, for the loss of the other people who had traditionally funded that are now withdrawing because they don't like what all of you are doing. Would you agree?
I would agree, yes, to a certain extent. It still can be pretty, and I'm curious what Kimberly was saying as well, coming from a little smaller site. It still can be pretty daunting. So, for example, we've just begun this research a couple of years ago on LGBTQIA. And personally, and it's akin to when we started doing African-American interpretation 40 years ago. And we haven't done much interpretation with the research, but we've done a couple of things. It got picked up by the right-wing media that we were doing, basically, that we were doing lesbian reenactments, that we were doing. We're not doing reenactments of anything, but it got picked up, and it was just a barrage of people calling me or calling the CEO. It was the local Baptist minister calling me and telling me that I was going to die. I was going to die and go to hell for the work that I'm doing. That can be really tough when you are just trying to raise the stories of people who've been silenced by a dominant culture. And you're just trying to bring them forward. So I would really say that we're pushing, we're going to keep pushing, and we're going in the right direction, all of us. But we have to rely on each other sometimes to just get that support. And I see Elizabeth asked a question in the chat about support, and I'm not exactly sure what she meant, but for an institution like ours, we just need to have all of you understand what we're trying to do and help share that. And I'm sure Gary and Kimberly would say the same thing, as well as all of our cultural partners. Just help us, just support us, and help spread the word of what we are trying to do and what our role is in this democracy. Because we do have a role. We have a really important role, just as important as educators, just as important as higher education, just as important as public education. But it's more accepting, but you still are going to have those detractors. You're still going to have people coming after your site, and just like Kimberly, ours was shuttered for 2-3 months, not because of the pandemic, but because of physical threats to our institution, people that started a fire in one of our buildings. So we've all had that, and we've seen that happen in other institutions as well, just because we were telling the story of African Americans, which is the American story. So it's still there. It's maybe a little bit better, but it's still there.
Thank you.
I would agree with everything Beth said. On our scale, it's just a constant push. Some days are better than others. Every once in a while, we'll get a call, and someone will call and leave a message on our answering machine and just say, "We're really proud of the work that you're doing. Keep it up." And that's literally it. And you're like, "Oh, thank God." And then other days, I did 1 year with the Christmas program, and I know I come back to that one because people tend to have really intense reactions. I had a guy, confront me at the front desk, curse at me, and then hysterically cry in my office for 10 minutes. You know, so I'm like, it's a constant thing. And probably back to the support, you know, one of the things is just we are greatly impacted by the people who are most vocal. So because we're a state historic site, if you have someone who's really vocal and calling their local legislator and they don't want us to be telling a certain story or telling another story, that can greatly impact us on a day-to-day basis. And so we need more diverse voices that support the site to be able to tell diverse stories. And that's the best way to support us, is to be vocal, because there are times when we haven't been able to say things or do things that we wanted to do. So I would leave it at that.
Thank you.
Briefly, I'd say we still have a lot of work to do there. I think our visitation is more diverse, but I've through the pandemic, starting in 2009, in my role that I assumed then, I've got 13 years of recursive visitor survey data, part of which, you know, we ask for when people care to share it, their race or ethnic background. That needle hasn't moved a lot, at least as self-reported. But anecdotally, certainly for particular programs, and certainly I would say, I think there has been greater diversity of visitation, but what there definitely has been is greater diversity of collaborators, buy-in from other stakeholders, community engagement. And that's because in part, you know, we hired a community engagement officer who's a descendant, actually. And we just brought on here last month one of my colleagues on the leadership team, who's our first vice president of DEAI, of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, to help strengthen that. So I think, you know, we still have work to do there, but we're seeing some encouragement in that process.
Thank you. And we're down to the end here. We have one more question very quickly, very briefly, if you could answer, and that is, you know, there's currently issues regarding public education, and with the attack on public education, you know, do public history sites feel the need to fill in, and do they feel the need to or do they feel that they will be next in terms of this idea of being under attack? You've kind of danced around the edges there, but if you could briefly answer that, I'd be appreciative. Thank you.
I don't know who wants to go first, but I would say, you know, kind of back to what I was just saying, I do think, you know, as a government, like state historic, our funding comes from the General Assembly. I mean, there is an element of, that's why what I was saying is so important. I think it is important to have diverse voices and people who are actively involved in communicating with their representatives, so that, you know, we can make sure that we are able to tell a broad and inclusive narrative. I will say that there is, since we're a fairly remote site, we're 4 hours from the Capitol where the General Assembly is. So we generally are going to tell the narratives. So I will say I have received pushback in other ways. For example, you know, when I started, we were still flying a third national Confederate flag over the visitor center, which was not, you know, historically accurate for the site. You know, that took me 1.5 years to get down. But it's back to what Beth said. I think it's just, yes, I think I definitely have felt at times with this conversation happening around the classroom that we are filling in and having to serve a role that, like, teachers are not necessarily being able to talk about, or struggling talking about in our classroom. We have more freedom to do so at the site. I don't foresee that changing at Advanced Birthplace, but I can't speak to any of the others.
Thank you.
I'd say quickly, we've seen waves of this over time over a variety of issues. So I think to the degree that it happens, we'll have to manage it, but we'll rely on our partners and our trustees and our people who are engaged with us to help. But we're a private nonprofit foundation. We're not state or federally funded, so that gives us some space to be able to deal with sometimes that kind of pushback.
Yeah, same thing as Gary, private nonprofit. We have to walk that line very carefully of being nonpartisan in what we present. But we honestly, I will be truthful to you, we feel a burning passion, a burning need, a deep desire to make sure that these stories are being told because of the absence of them or the threat to them being taken out of public schools. So we just see our role as being even probably more important than it ever has been going forward. And I say that as all of us. I don't mean just Colonial Williamsburg, but I think all of us feel that in many, many ways, but we definitely do at Colonial Williamsburg.
Well, thank you so much. And just want to say thank you to everyone who was here today. We really appreciate it. These conversations are so important, and we're just glad that you're here. And Jules, will you tell them when our next event is coming up?
You bet. We would love to have you join us for the next Useable Past. If you go to mckinneycenter.com, you'll be able to register for our next event. This one has been recorded, and you will be able to see it, review it again on the McKinney Center's website, mckinneycenter.com. Thank you. This was incredible. Thank you so much, Kim and Gary and Beth. What an amazing conversation we've had here today. And thank you to all the participants who came. Be sure to sign up again, mckinneycenter.com. And thanks to the Langston Center, the Heritage Alliance, East Tennessee State University's Black American Studies Department, and the McKinney Center for being co-partners in putting this event on.